Okay, so in the last video, we just looked really quickly at how we can use the script tag in the head of our HTML document to load a library that's going to give us additional functions, make our JavaScript writing life easier, and sort of a context in which we might use this, right? Which is basically that because it takes time for us to load other information from the internet, things that are stored in other places, which we very frankly very frequently want to use, we're going to start our sort of journey down this path with looking at this function called document ready. It's a jQuery function. It has a version in sort of regular or raw JavaScript, but writing out that version of the function is long and complicated. And so one of the reasons why we love to use jQuery is because it makes it short and sweet. Right? All we have to do is this sort of special $sign, which is what tells our browser that the function that we are asking it to look at should be, it should look it up in the jQuery library. That's a convention established by jQuery. And just, hey, when you get that flag from the browser that says everything's been loaded, then I want you to do this write to console function, right? So our write to console function, very, very simple, doesn't do a whole heck of a lot, just writes a statement, just writes out to the console, hey, now my document is ready. So just as a quick refresher, we can see this in action. And whoops, here we are. Right? Now, even if I try really hard, right, it seems like this happens almost instantaneously. And again, that's because we haven't actually asked our page to load much from the outside world. Now, obviously, we can think of times when this is likely to happen. We might have images. Of course, we can always just write image tags. We might have other libraries and resources, but the place that it happens for us most often is when we're loading data, right? So in our first exercise, in our candy sorter exercise, we sort of elected to use a really small subset of data. Obviously, it was data that we sort of constructed around our little Hershey bar example, but not very complex, doesn't take up a lot of space, right? In a case like this, we don't mind kind of putting our data directly in our script because it's not very big, it's not very complicated, it's unlikely that it's going to kind of get messed up somehow. Very often, however, we are either getting our data from another source, for example, from an API, which means that because we want it to be refreshing on a constant basis. So, for example, if we wanted to be pulling some, Twitter data in, right? We can't save a copy of the Twitter data. And if we want it to be up to date, right? So we have to go through this process of kind of asking Twitter, hey, well, get me the latest version of this data, and I'm going to load it into my web page. And that's where the power of this document ready and what we call AJAX calls, or asynchronous JavaScript and XML, that's AJAX, comes into play. Here's the trick. A lot of times AJAX is now done not with XML, but actually with JSON. But nobody felt like changing the acronym, so we still call it AJAX. Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And you guys will be reading about this this week as well. But again, one of the major features that this gives us is the ability to load outside data. So like I said, not such a big deal with our candy sorter, but let's look at another example for how about our gun laws graphic from the other day, right? It's actually quite a lot of data going on here, right? We have 8 categories, each of which has some sort of distinct individual information, over 50 states. That's, how many is that? 400 pieces of information. That's a lot. Now, here a little inspect element trickery. I have located the actual script file where of the code that actually drives this interactive, or most of this interactive. Now, they've made a choice here, which is they've actually decided to put their so-called state data with all of this information directly into their JavaScript file. I think they're kind of brave for doing this. I think maybe not so clever too. The problem is that if this data were to change, really only really only the coders would be able to get at it. And in my experience, you always want to try to make updating data as easy as possible for editors, because very often you're not going to have the bandwidth to go in there and make that tweaky little text change. You want them to be able to do it themselves. At the same time, you want to make sure that anything that they change in the data doesn't somehow screw up your script. So we tend to keep this I tend to keep these larger data sets in separate files, in separate JSON files. So as we noted the other day, there's actually enormous, that JSON, JavaScript object notation, is actually basically the same thing as a JavaScript object. So if I take this whole thing and paste it in, first of all, it ends up in one giant line. And secondly, we see that there's a little bit of difference in our JavaScript variable, right? So in this case, they've actually declared it as a JavaScript variable, the same way that we did with candy list. What's a handy way to convert this into a JSON object? It's actually really simple. All I'm going to do is get rid of that var and put a curly brace. And I need to make sure that I put that state data, what was my variable name, into quotation marks. Change my equal sign to a colon, and then all the way at the end, right, I'm going to actually change that last semicolon to a curly brace. And now, if I did it correctly, boom. All of a sudden, this is also why we love JSON-lint, because it makes beautifully formatted JSON. It both tells us if it's correct, and it makes it way, 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 way easier to read. So now all of a sudden, I have this JavaScript, or this JSON file, right? It's a pretty big file. I don't really want to go pasting that into my script here, right? I'd like to keep it safe and sound, clean and simple, all on its own. And so in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and take this. I'm going to copy my results right out of JSON-lint. I'm going to come back to my Aptana, and I'm going to say new from template. JSON is actually a blank file. It's just a text file. I'm just going to paste the whole thing in there. And now I'm going to save it, right? Same saving I usually do. Let's call this again JSON, right? I still need to give it a file extension. So I need to, I'll call this Guardian gun laws, JSON. Okay, I have to give it the file extension, JSON. Great. Oh, now we see Aptana's actually done some nice work with that. It's color-coded it for us, so it's kind of easier to read. Pretty fantastic. Now, let's say I wanted to load that data into my code so that I could do stuff with it, right? We talked about all the things that we could do when we did our exercise on Friday morning. We saw how even some of the simple stuff that you guys wanted to do with the nets data, you could actually do with the for loop that you had already learned to write. So the trick is, though, that, of course, how do I get this into my document? And in order to do this, we're going to use another special jQuery function called get. And what get lets us do is it actually lets us load dynamically this data that's in our separate JSON file, right? So it's a way of saying, hey, HTML, I don't want to keep this in the same place. I'm just going to ask you to go ahead and load this when I tell you to. So once again, there's a question of, well, how do I find out what this get function looks like? Or perhaps even more importantly, that the get function exists. Now, for the second question, pretty much you're going to find out here. One of the reasons why we've designed the course this way is to try to point you guys in the most efficient direction for kind of getting done the tasks that are most relevant to journalists. But typically, or I should say in addition to that, right, we're always going to be looking through the API documentation. We're going to do a lot of API documentation reading this term, not for its own sake, but so that you guys get practiced at it. Because again, this is about a certain kind of literacy. And if we go to the API documentation, and that stands for Application Programming Interface, you'll also have a little brush up reading on that. This is going to be where we can sort of extend and expand our knowledge and really be able to solve the problems that we want to solve, right? It's not possible for, to address all of the possible issues that all the possible tasks that you might want to do with data or with visualization, by simply giving you, these are the methods that you use, right? What we can do is we can talk about some of the broad stroke stuff that we use on a regular basis, right? And then sort of strategies for discovering new things or finding out solutions to problems as you encounter them. So if I go to the API documentation here and I look for get, I have a few results that come up, and This one looks pretty good, retrieve DOM elements. DOM elements basically means pieces of an HTML page. This one, however, looks even better. And actually, if we see here, they actually reference the fated Ajax in this. And again, documentation reading is a skill. It's a little bit like reading any kind of, specialized material. But don't worry too much about this right now, because we're going to skip right to the good stuff. And just the way when we went over the for loop and we sort of looked at how the pieces of that function are laid out, what we're going to see is that a get request, which is what we use when we want to load data, has three main functions. So for now, I'm actually just going to do this in comments, right? I'm going to label, did I do that right? And I always, by the way, I always keep the documentation open, because otherwise I forget what I'm doing, right? So it's going to say URL of data, right? First I'm going to give it the URL of the data. The second thing I'm going to give it is the name of function to call when successful, or call when data loaded. Okay, and then the third thing I'm going to give it is the type of data to load. Or maybe that's better called data format. Okay, so what do these three parameters mean? Well, URL of data, right, is going to be the URL of wherever our JSON file is living. So let's start with that piece. Okay, that was I commented that, right? So that's a way for me to keep that sort of, that's where I keep my real language, my English reference for what I'm doing, just, right close by. So I'm going to say, don't know why that's doing that. Hey now, let's make sure that I didn't, right, that looks correct. Let's try this again. Get, okay. So the first argument that I pass this is the URL of the data. In this case, it's easy because it's right next door, and it's called guardian gun laws.json. Now I have to write the name of the function to call when the data is loaded. Now, this is always a bit of a catch-22, right? There's a paradox here because I haven't actually written the function yet. Now, it's up to you guys how you want to approach this. I tend to first write the name of the function and then write the function afterwards, because I find filling this out a little nerve-wracking. So I kind of like to just get it over with and not come back in later. So let's just say I'm going to create a function called gun data loaded. Okay, I'm making a promise to myself with that. I'm saying I'm going to write that function. And then data format, which is going to be JSON, right? This value could also be XML, for example, or text. Those are the primary ones that we see on the web. And now, right away, right? And if we remember, before we can refer to a function, right, we have to have described it in our code. So same way that our document ready, right, that referenced write to console happens after the function write to console, I need to write my function gun data loaded to come, I have to write the function before I try to use it somewhere else. Now, this is a little trick, right? Remember when well, it's not really a trick. Remember we were saying that what this function is going to do, this get function is going to say, is going to go to this URL, right, or in this case right next door to that file, and it's going to grab all of that text, all of that data, right, and bring it back inside this file. So the question is, once it's back, where does it put that stuff? And the answer is it puts it into an argument called data. Now, actually, I can call this argument anything that I want, right, as we've seen before, because this is the uni. This is the uni within the function for that data. But this variable, gun data, or just data, whatever you prefer, I don't know, we'll leave it as data for now. That function has all of the material. That data variable is this stuff, okay? So it's a little hard to get one's head around right at the beginning. But basically, that is the same thing. And the way that I can prove this is I can go right back to console log and console log out my data and take a look at it. So let's give it a shot. Uh-oh, problem. we'll have to troubleshoot that next time.